Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of April 28th through May 4th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. And this week, we actually have a lot of interesting updates. The pace of operations is starting to pick up. I'll give my own theory on why that is. And but let's go straight into what's happening on the ground. And we're going to start with where I think one of the most important, where we've been focusing on for almost a month now, the Toretsk direction. And specifically the area between Toretsk and Minigrad, this area here, which has basically been quiet ever since the Battle of Avdiivka ended over a year ago. But, now it's come to life in the last month, and the Russians are making rapid progress here. And this week, where the Russians are making progress is in the eastern direction. The more western direction, I should say. Sorry. And one of the biggest changes, which I was completely surprised by, was that the Russians have broken through from their positions in Tarasovka and have broken through into the village of Nove, this village right here. And not only that, it looks like they have captured this village. And not only that, as you can see, there's these water reservoirs that go, kind of like this. And there's also a water reservoir right here. And so the Russians also crossed this water reservoir and captured some positions on the other side of this river here. And this is a very big deal. I was not expecting this at all. I thought the capture of Tarasovka, might have been a bit of a, the commanders in this direction jumped the shark, you could say. I thought, maybe they were prematurely saying this, but that actually is not true. It looks like they actually did take Tarasovka and did some sort of major operation that made the Ukrainians break, and the Russians reached the village Nove. This is a very big deal. This is one of the villages the Russians have to take on their way towards reaching this this huge reservoir in the north here, and the main goal for both directions is to reach the village of Nove here. And so the Russians are, swooping up the western flank, just as, the goal from the Toretsk direction is to reach the eastern flank here. But yeah, the breakthrough to Nove is a very big deal. Not only that, because, not only does it, make the Russians get one step closer to achieving their operational goal in this area, but it also helps the Russians defend their flank a little bit. As you can see, with these two water reservoirs, the Russians, if they could take, these areas between these two reservoirs here, then, they defend their flanks really well. If the Ukrainians want to attack, they're going to have to, funnel themselves into this narrow corridor, and the Russians will be able to deflect it. I do think the next thing for the Russians will be to take the village of Nove, which is actually what they're doing now. We actually have a bunch of geolocated confirmation of the Russians. A lot of sources say they have not entered it just yet, but most sources are saying they basically broke through and captured a bunch of these tree lines that are around Nove, breaking through from these two villages. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians break through and at least take this part of Nove. There's some little warehouses and this area on the other side of the reservoir in this area. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians took at least the main part of Nove. So that way they have this reservoir to hold their western flank, and then they have this reservoir, and then they could take everything between it. And then what the Russians will probably do is take something like this. Take everything beneath these red lines, and then this would greatly improve their situation on the western, on this western Toretsk direction here. But yeah, so the breakthrough Nove allows them to do that. I think the Russians will then start storming Nove, which they already are right on the outskirts of. I wouldn't be surprised if they're already in it. We just don't have any updates from any geolocations just yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are already operating in the southern part of it. But yeah, so the breakthrough Nove is one of a very big deal tactically here. So I was kind of surprised because they were kind of stuck up in Tarasovka for almost a month here, and I thought, oh my god, the Russian commanders here are a bunch of retards. But it looks like there was some sort of good operation, and they managed to break through to Nove here. So we shall see how this develops. Also, kind of as we're talking here, the Russians are now pushing towards the village of Alexandropol. They took a bunch of these fields between Tarasovka and Alexandropol, which makes sense. The Ukrainians probably retreated to this village. And if the Ukrainians, with the loss of Nove, the Russians could probably try to, scare the Ukrainians and Alexandropol, oh my gosh, if the Russians are already operating to the north of us, maybe we need to retreat to Zoria. So, maybe this breakthrough could also facilitate the capture of Alexandropol, which is where the Russians are trying to push towards. This would, not only, secure their northern flank here, but this would also allow them to have a position to start storming Zoria, which is one of the main, now kind of more legit, the main like kind of hub of Ukrainian resistance in this area before they reach Alexandra Kalanovo. Because taking Alexandropol will give the Russians the space to attack Zoria from the side here and then break this entire defense line. Because right now the Ukrainians are trying to stop the Russians from attacking directly northwards. Right now their eastern flank is protected by Shirobrenka and Novospatsky, which they've so far prevented the Russians from taking. But if the Russians capture Alexandropol, then their western flank will be exposed. So the Russians are, they kind of made a bit of a breakthrough after Tarasovka fell. Breaking through north towards Novolenovka, breaking through to the east towards Alexandropol, and breaking through to the west towards Novopoltovka. So probably the main goal for the Russians in the next week or so is to take something like this here. So, this will probably be where the Russians will be at, and then we shall see what the Russians do after this. As you can see, the reservoir continues going something like this. So, the Russians might just move along this reservoir, start battling for the village of Yapolunovka, and then use the river as a natural defense here. And that's probably what the Russians will be doing here, just use the river as a defense. And then also move here towards Zoria, collapse it, and then, and then the Russians will probably just start breaking through towards the east here, and then just collapse this entire line, and then just kind of reach this northern reservoir here, which is kind of the main direction for this area. The Russians are also making rapid progress, kind of more in the eastern part here. The Russians are now battling for the eastern outskirts of Malinovka here. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this area right here. We don't know if the Russians were able to consolidate, but the battle for Malinovka has started. We shall see if the Russians develop on that. So as you can see, the Russians are now pushing very strongly in this direction, because not only does it help the Russians reach the water reservoir here, breaking through here allows them to start cutting off Minograd from the eastern direction here. The village of Miroluvki, we don't know the exact confirmation of that yet. We got GLK confirmation of the Russians being here like 2 weeks ago, but we don't know if the Russians consolidated here. We don't know if the Ukrainians pushed them out. Pro-Russian sources say they have basically captured most of this village. Pro-Ukrainian sources says they kicked the Russians out. We just need more confirmation of what's exactly happening here. But if the Russians have taken this, again, they have this river to defend their flank here. So if the Russians have taken Miroluvka, this could allow them to take out all these fields to the south of Malinovka here. And then, that actually could secure their gains to actually be able to take Malinovka itself. And then the Russians will then try to focus on Mirnya and Mykolaievka here, which will be the next goals after that. And then from that, they'll be able to then cut off this major artery that supports the eastern Minograd. So yeah, the breakthrough in this western part of the Tourette's direction is expanding very rapidly, and we shall see what the Russians do from there. And then kind of more in the Tourette's direction itself, there's been some progress here as well. More on here, this is the Russians are now, we now have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in the southern part of Staromykolaievka, so the Russians broke through and captured this area right here. So we do have confirmation the Russians are battling for this town. Or this village, but there is a lot of, I do expect the Ukrainians trying to hold on to this as much as possible. The Ukrainians still have, the Russians, according to mappers, have not cleared these trenches that are to the sides here, so, the flanks are not really as secure, and, the Ukrainians still hold Alexandropol, the Ukrainians still hold Romanovka, so Staromykolaievka can still hold for now, but, if the Russians continue pushing here and start pushing, as I mentioned before, and if the Russians push from here towards Romanovka, then Staromykolaievka will probably fall pretty quickly, but the Russians are also doing a frontal assault here to probably try to pin the Ukrainian forces that are here, but yeah, we do have GLA confirmation that the battle for Staromykolaievka has started. And then towards the Sukal Balka area, we talked about how last week the Russians have captured this village. This week, the Russians are now pushing north of Sukal Balka and have captured a bunch of these fields to the north of it. So they have captured these fields right here. And accordingly, they're now pushing towards the village of Romanovka here. So, so we shall see if the Russians can reach Romanovka. But yeah, the Russians are now exploiting their Sukal Balka breakthrough, or their capture of Sukal Balka, to start trying to flank the Ukrainian defenses in the eastern part here. So, the Ukrainian positions here are very tenuous. I wouldn't be surprised that by the end of May, the Ukrainians retreat back to Alexandra Kalanovo, and hell, maybe if the Russian, if the Russians could break through here, they could then assist the Russians who are kind of stuck in Toretsk by, if the Russians could capture something like this, right? They have captured something like this, then they could continue just pushing along the reservoir towards Kilim and Bulka and Katerinovka, and then this would collapse the Ukrainian positions here, and then they could, do something like this. So, and this would secure, push the Russians all the way up to Konstantinovka. So, as you can see, the battle for, the Russians are doing, with their battle, trying to finish the battle for Chasiv Yar, for trying to pull up the front here. It looks like one of the main goals of the Russian summer offensive is for Konstantinovka here. So, we shall see how that goes. And then in Toretsk itself, we have geolocated confirmation the Ukrainians are indeed still in Sherbrink and Novospatsky. I have a hard time understanding how the Russians are not able to take these two villages, but this is definitely a big headache for the Russians. But where the Russians are making, so in terms of their kind of like more western flank here, it's being a bit harder to secure. But on the more eastern part here, more in the north here, the Russians are making a lot of progress. First of all, the Russians are battling for this mine shaft. I think we talked about this last week, but we do have geolocated confirmation the Russians are at least in control of half of it. But we also have geolocated confirmation the Ukrainians entering in and trying to dismount troops, and the Russians blowing up the vehicle there. So it's probably a back and forth, but it does show that this mine shaft is being contested. If the Russians could take it, this would give them a forward operating base to hold on, pull off, to push the Ukrainians out from northern Toretsk here. So the battle for mine shaft is still ongoing. And the Russians are also making rapid progress around the village of Dachna here. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians last week being here. We the map change it. This mapper has said that everything along these lakes, I think it's called a children's summer playground or some shit. But anyway, this area has been captured by the Russians. We also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being kind of more here as well. So my guess is that the Russians have captured everything along these rivers here. And we also, as we mentioned last week, the Russians entered Dachna with motorcycles from their positions in these fields. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians actually have captured something like this as well. And captured Dachna. We don't have 100% confirmation just yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case, and the Ukrainians fell back to Dolinovka right here. But yeah, so the Russians are making very much more better progress in the more northern sector, or the more eastern sector here. The Russians are also improving their positions in this area right here, capturing some more of these fields here. So while the Russians are struggling in this Kilbin, Balka, Katerinovka, and Novospatsky area, they're making some decent progress near Dachna, Druzhba, Krimsky, and such like that. So the goal here, as I mentioned before, is to secure their flanks here, so that because if the Russians could push the Ukrainians back to this water reservoir, Toretsk will be secure from the north, and then if they want to secure the other part of northern Toretsk, or the northeastern part of Toretsk, they'll have to secure Dolinovka and someplace, just secure more of these areas right here, and then I wouldn't be surprised this would also allow the Russians to clear out this area once the Russians take Chasiv Yar, because the Russians will need to clear this area as well if they want to start the battle for Konstantinovka. So right now the Russians are basically putting up a lot of how do you say this? A lot of preparations before they could do the battle for Konstantinovka, but the preparations are ongoing. Alrighty, that is the Toretsk direction. A lot of interesting things happening here. It's probably one of the most interesting parts of the front line. But now let us go to the Pokrovsk direction, and this is where the Pokrovsk direction is now where the Russians are making a lot of decent progress as well. And there's some interesting things to talk about in this direction. One of the major things is that we saw a geolocated confirmation that the Russians were in this area right here, but according to most sources now, it's that those were just some sabotage and reconnaissance groups, not necessarily a occupying Russian force. Anyway, so it doesn't, I was actually I'm like, whoa, the Russians are already here, and a lot of sources are saying the Russians have taken Zornia, but it seems like that was a bit of a jumping the shark moment. But what we do have geolocated confirmation of is that the Russians are in this area right here, and this area right here. Yeah, so it does look like the Russians are improving their positions around Shantevko and trying to take these kind of fields right here. So this definitely, this would make sense, because, how would the Russians be able to cross all these areas all the way into here if these areas weren't clear just yet? But, yeah, so it does show that the Russians are now improving their positions towards Pokrovsk itself. One of the main things the Russians have to do is take the village of Zornia, and specifically take this Terrakon, and then secondly take this Terracon. If they could take Zornia and Leonardo da Vinci here, then they could, then taking these two small little suburbs will allow them to actually enter Pokrovsk itself in the southern part. So, but they need to take these two Terracons first, and it looks like the Russians are slowly but surely trying to improve their positions to be able to do that. And then more towards here, we know the Russians are in Udachna. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this area right here. So at least this eastern part of Udachna is under Russian control, or at least the Russians have some positions here. But it does show that the battle for Udachna is still ongoing. The Ukrainians have not pushed the Russians fully out of there. And then one of the most interesting areas, I would say, is that, Jesus, I keep clicking this area. Anyway, where the Russians actually made some very interesting progress, which in the grand scheme of things is not much, but it is actually very interesting, is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Nove Alexandrivka, and this is actually a very big news. So the way the Russians did this week is that the Russians have captured a bunch of these fields that were north of Nadivka here, and then from there they were able to break through into Nove Alexandrivka and basically reach the Solona River. And because of that, the Russians have also retaken the village of Uspenivka. So everything below the Solona River here has been captured by the Russians, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue using the Solona River to move towards Novomykolaiivka here and try to reach the Dnipro Oblast. Now, so taking over Alexandrivka, if the Russians could hold on to it, will basically secure their gains in Uspenivka. And not only that, this will probably allow the Russians to move towards the southern part of Udachna and start being able to actually secure Udachna itself. So, as you know, the Russians have been battling for Uspenivka for a very long time. It's been longer than the dinosaur has been dead. But now that they've captured Nova Alexandrivka, I think Uspenivka can finally be secured and it's no longer a back and forth here. And then more towards the southern part here, where the Russians are trying to reach the Dnipro Oblast, the Russians are, the Ukrainians are holding on to all their might to prevent the Russians from reaching the Dnipro Oblast. The main thing is the Russians are right now battling for this farm village of Konstantinovka. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians entering here. So the battle for Konstantinovka is still ongoing, but, the Ukrainians really want to hold on to this farm. And then also the battle for Toruska and Bogdanovka is still ongoing. Depending on who you ask, Russian sources are saying Toruska and Bogdanovka are under Russian control, but Ukrainians are saying that it's under their control. We just need more GLK confirmation. The only thing I think is for certain that both sides agree on is that the village of Gorovko is still under full Ukrainian control. So the Ukrainians still have positions to prevent the Russians from reaching the Dnipro Oblast, but the Russians are trying to break through these deadlock of villages here. But yeah, so that is the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians are now trying to battle into Pokrovsk itself. They're now trying to reach the Dnipro Oblast, trying to reach Novopoltovka. So the Russians are back on the offensive here, and we shall see how and I do think one of the main goals of the Russian summer offensive is to finally take Pokrovsk and Minigrad and Novopoltovka. So I do think the Russians will be able to do that within 4 months or so by the end of the summer, but we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the South Donetsk direction, and this is where the Russians kind of slowed. The Russians were this is where the Russians were pretty active in the fall time, also fall time, but also in the springtime a little bit when everyone else was kind of slowing down. But it seems like once the summer started, it kind of slowed down a little bit. Well, I guess the summer hasn't really quite started yet, but it's starting to. But the Russians now have made a very big breakthrough here, is that the Russians have now started the battle for Baratar. We have seen a bunch of the Russian sources showing them bombing Baratar to the ground. A lot of bombings from artillery, from fabs, from everything. And so the Russians really want to take Baratar because these two villages are preventing the Russians from continuing pushing towards the Dnipro Oblast and to liberate the rest of South Donetsk. This week we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in the southern part of Baratar. Hold up. So we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being right here. And we shall see if the Russians, right now they didn't take Oleshkovki, they haven't taken Ordania, so Baratar still has their flanks secure, so the Russians are just doing a frontal attack. So it's going to be pretty bloody, I believe, but it looks like the Russians, apparently the Russians weren't able to break through towards Aliski. They weren't able to break through towards Ordania because the Ukrainians kept doing counterattacks. But the Russians have been doing, slowly but surely reaching Baratar. They took Roseville, as you can see. They, took these fields between Konstantinovka and Roseville. They also reached Baratar from the east, are taking more of these fields here. So they were doing step by step, week by week, getting closer to Baratar. And they're like, listen, we can't break through towards Oleshki. We can't break through towards Ordania. So we'll just do a frontal attack and take Baratar. If they take Baratar, this would kind of actually will break the Ukrainian resistance here, at least, break, and then the Ukrainians will have to retreat towards Kamar, probably try to, and then, actually, I don't know what the Ukrainians will do here, because, there's only a bunch of small little villages here, but we shall see how, Baratar is one of the last major villages before the Dnipro Oblast here, so that's probably why they're holding on to it so long, but we shall see if the Russians can hold on to their positions in Baratar and push the Ukrainians out, but we need to see. Alrighty, and then elsewhere in the South Donetsk direction, the Russians are still battling for the village of Leniapolia to secure their flank here. It's been going on for months now. We do have GLK confirmation of the Russians actually being in Leniapolia in the center here, but I don't know why it's taking so long. Like, I would think the Russians would try to at least secure this village as much as possible, because capturing Leniapolia would allow them to start actually battling for Shentemko. But right now it looks like the Russians basically reached these two villages and then stopped, or at least maybe the Ukrainians are putting up a bunch of fierce resistance here. But we do have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in Leniapolia. We also have GLK confirmation that the Russians have captured these fields between Leniapolia and Volska here. So if that is true, then the Russians have another axis of attack besides from the east. They can attack from the south here, and then taking Leniapolia will secure their flank here. And then from here, they could then attack Shentemko from the south as well as from the east. But yeah, so the Russian push towards Kamar and everything from this direction has slowed down a lot. But the battle for Leniapolia is now ongoing. And then some, I guess, news from Zaporozhye and Kherson. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but the Russians got kicked out from Malak Takhmachka, so it looks like they're not actually entering here. And then another thing is that the Russians have, that's actually it. The Russians stopped their offensive in this area right here. And then in the Kherson direction, the Russians, there's nothing changes. There's just some rumors going around that the Russians are now building up forces here. And according to some Russian sources, they've taken these islands to the north of Krinky right here. And also, they've taken the islands on this area right here. These islands right here. We don't have any GLK confirmation of that, but just something that's being mentioned here. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. I think the Russians will be making a mistake trying to make another bridgehead on the Kherson direction, because we saw what happened in Krinky, but just something to keep in mind here. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Chasiv Yar direction, and this area is, we talked about how the Russians are battling for Stupochki, but we don't have any more updates since then from last week, but, the Russians really need to take Stupochki in order to actually secure Chasiv Yar, so we shall see if that is ongoing. We don't know if the Russians got kicked out yet, or if the Russians secured it, but the battle for Stupochki is still ongoing. The battle for the center of Chasiv Yar is still ongoing. We don't know, I still don't know if this is, I still don't know why the Russians aren't able to actually take the center of Chasiv Yar. They're surrounded on multiple angles, but so the center of Chasiv Yar is still being held by the Ukrainians. So yeah, this is holding up the Russians, and they need to take Chasiv Yar to actually start the battle for Konstantinovka here. But where we do have some GLK confirmation of the Russians making some progress is in the village of Grigorivka here, and so we actually have GLK confirmation that the Russians have taken this forest right here, and they have taken more of this area right here towards the western part of Grigorivka. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians just reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal and just take it and then reach it. So if the Russians could do that, which I think they'll probably be able to now, then this secures the northern Chasiv Yar a little bit better. The only other thing the Russians will probably have to do is secure this this kind of quarry right here. And so if the Russians could take something like this, then they'll be in a very good position to secure their northern gains for Chasiv Yar. And then in the Seversk direction, the Russians are making some more progress in these fields here. As I mentioned, in order for the Russians to actually secure Verkha Mainanska and Grigorivka here, the Russians will have to take the rest of this, I think they call the Bilohola Mountains or something, or this Bilohola Hill. They need to take the rest of it, and the Russians have captured about half of it, so they have positions on this hill, but they have to take all of it in order to actually secure Grigorievka and Verkhovenyanska, which are on low ground here. But we do have some changes in Grigorievka here, and the Russians have entered Grigorievka itself. They have entered the center part of this village, so they have captured this area, kind of the more eastern part of Grigorievka. They have captured also some more of these fields around the southern part of it. So the Russians are trying to storm Grigorievka, but I think that is a bad idea until maybe not now, because they could take eastern Grigorievka since they have taken the eastern part of this hill, so they could probably secure themselves here. But if they want to take like western Grigorievka right here, they have to take the rest of this mountain right here. This not mountain, but this hill and all that. So taking this hill will be the only way they'll be able to actually secure Grigorievka. But right now I think they're trying to pull up their flank here and take maybe the eastern part of Grigorievka so they could continue pushing here. So yeah, the Russians are battling for this village, and we shall see how the Russians develop that. Alrighty, now let us go to the Le Mans direction, and in the Le Mans direction, the Russians are also making a lot of progress. One of the biggest changes this week in all the front lines is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Nove. Now, this is not surprising. We've been talking about the battle for Nove for about 2 weeks now, and slowly but surely, the Russians were constricting it from the north, from the south. They took the eastern part of it, so it wasn't any surprise that the Russians have completely captured the rest of this village, and capturing Nove secures their northern defense a lot better for their bridgehead here that they're developing on the other side of the Zhirbrets River. So yeah, the battle for Nove is done. They have captured it. A lot of pro-Russian sources are also saying they are battling for the village of Lipovka here, which I think is just the village in all but name. But I think they should be able to take it here, along with Zelina Dolona here, which are just 2 little villages. So the Russians will probably try to take these 2 villages, which will probably fall within a week or so. And along with this, the Russians are still pushing, between their Novomikhailivka and Makivka. They've taken some more of these tree lines here. So slowly but surely, they're trying to reach the village of Grigivka here. So the northern part is where the Russians are making a lot of rapid progress. The capture of Nove is a very big deal, and we shall see how the Russians develop after that. But yeah, the northern part of their Zhirbrets region is expanding very well. The southern part has slowed down a bit, but if they want to actually, make a good progress there, they have to take the village of Kolodaski here, which according to last week the Russians have entered, but we don't have any geolocate confirmation of that. So we need to wait to see if the Russians could actually take this village to actually secure the southern part of their bridgehead here. But kind of on the other side of the Zhirbrets River, in the village of Toretska here, the Russians have actually captured. We actually have geolocate confirmation of the Russians being in the northern part of Toretska here, and have captured everything up to this. I think this little looks like mosque or some shit, but I don't think it's a mosque. But in any case, they probably have captured the northern part of Toretska here. We actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians actually being in this area, so and they have captured these fish farms, they call it. I think this is they've captured these fish farms. So capturing Nova Tereska because you give the Russians a position to continue taking the rest of Tereska, which is, this is split in half, so the Russians could actually maybe secure their flank a little bit. Because right now the Ukrainians still have positions in Zarychnia and Liman, which could secure here. But if the Russians take Kolodaski and then push towards Stavka, this could very much complicate the logistics here. And then the Russians could take Teretska and, have something like this. And then from here, if they take Teretska, the Russians could then break through towards Yampil, try to break through towards, the Seversky Donetsk River. That goes something like this. And so if they could take Yampil, not only will this start the battle for southern Liman, but this could also cut off all the Ukrainians that are in the Shirbransky forest. And then, if the Russians could actually, break through in the northern part of Seversk here, as you can see, the Russians could take Shirobranka and Grigorievka if they could take this hill here, so the Russians will have something like this going on. Then all the Russians have to do is basically, reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal or Seversky Donetsk River in the village of Dorovka here, and then, take something like this, just the northern part of Seversk. They don't even have the battle for Seversk, and then obviously the Russians will be in Yampil, and then from here, they'll collapse the entire Shirobranka forest and cut off the Ukrainians there. So I think the Seversk and Liman directions are kind of closely linked here. because I do think that a lot of sources are saying the Russians want to take Liman and Kupiansk for the summer campaign, but I think if they want to do that, also the Russians will have to be able to take Seversk as well. Alrighty, and I think that is the rest of the Liman direction. Now let us go to the Kupiansk direction. This week there's been some small changes. The biggest things is just some clarifications. Is that the Russians apparently are in control of Stepovy, but the Ukrainians are still in control of Kolpany. So that does make sense. This area right here, the Ukrainians are counterattacking in Nadivka. So if the Russians having this kind of bulge here, I wouldn't be surprised if this was more of a gray zone than full Russian control. But so we got some clarification that the Ukrainians are kind of mostly in control of Kolpany and the Russians are in control of Stepovy. So just some clarifications here. And then here the Russians are still batting for Stepov and Novoselivka. According to some sources, they have captured more of these rail lines south of it. So I don't know why they have not stormed this village just yet, because they are they have some positions to the north here, some positions to the south. So I won't be surprised that they try to actually take this village finally. But it's more of a I don't know why they've not actually taken it yet, but just the battle for Stepov and Novoselivka is still ongoing. And then one of the biggest changes in the Kupiansk direction is in our favorite Dorishnya bridgehead here, is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Kamianka. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians raising their flags. I don't know if I mentioned this last week. I think I skipped over the Kupiansk direction last week. But if I did go over it, then I'm just repeating myself. But if I have not, then just, yes, the village Kamianka is, now that I'm talking about it, I think I did talk about it last week, how the Russians made a bridge, were able to create a land bridge here with the capture of Kamianka here. But yeah, so I think I mentioned this already. But yeah, Kamianka has been captured, and the only thing that's maybe in Dallas, these northern warehouses, but we don't know. But we do have JK confirmation, at least the residential area, Kamianka has been taken. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kharkov direction. You might be wondering, what, really Kharkov? There's something changing here after months? Yes, there's been some small changes in the Kharkov direction. The biggest thing that's happened in the Kharkov direction is that we actually have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this bridge in the southern part right here. And so according to most sources, it seems like the Russians have captured everything to the north of this village right here, or the north of this Volchka River here, so this residential area. So this map has not been updated, but we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being here. We also have to remember about the factory here that used to change hands last summer back and forth. But the Russians, if the Russians could take back this factory, or if the Russians have taken back this factory and have secured their positions on this bridge here, then this actually gives the Russians a very solid position to take the rest of this residential area. I have no clue why the Russians aren't pushing to take the rest of this area, but I do think maybe this entire area was like razed to the ground. So, maybe there's not really much area to cover in. So it's like everything's been razed, so there's not really any point to taking it. Because this is how the town looked before the battle happened. And that if you look at the battle for Volchansk, it's basically like complete ruin. So there's not really anywhere else to hide, really. But if the Russians could take everything to the north of the river here, this would allow them to actually maybe secure their gains a little bit in northern Volchansk and push the Ukrainians to the southern part of it. But yeah, that's the Kharkov direction. And now let us go to the Sumy direction. And this is where the Russians are continuously trying to create their border zone here. One of the biggest things, so in this direction, the main thing is, well, just a few things. The first thing is the Russians have completely pushed the Ukrainians out of the Belgorod direction. The Russians have retaken the village of Popovka and Dymy Todovko here, and so I've pushed the Ukrainians back to the other side of the border here. So the Ukrainian incursion to Belgorod is a failure. The Russians retook their two villages here. And then in Gornal here, the Russians they took the village last week and liberated Kursk, and this week they've just taken some of these fields around Gornal, so they've taken these fields here. So the Russians have reached the Russian-Ukraine war border and just, secured their gains here a little bit. So after the village of Gornal fell, the Ukrainians fell back to the other side of the international border, so they've been doing that. And then finally, the Russians have are now one of the biggest things in the Sumy direction here specifically is that the Russians have captured most of the village of Bilodovo here. So we have they've captured a lot of these fields around Bilodovo here. So the Bilodovo is kind of very elongated like Basovka. So as you can see, there is this southern part of Bilodovo which might be still under Ukrainian control. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take the rest of this village. And this will allow them to continue pushing towards and cutting off Yunatovka from the west here. So the Russians are, improving their bridgehead here a lot, their Sumy bridgehead here a little bit, and we shall see if the Russians could develop their offensive here. But I do think if the Russians want to continue pushing, they'll have to take some of these villages here. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take Volodymyrivka, Volodovka, Novomykolaievka, and Varachina here. So I do think that one of the main goals for the Russians is to take something like this, and then from here they'll be able to actually cut off Yunatovka and then storm it from multiple angles here. So yeah, the main goal for the Russians is to take Yunatovka, which is the main goal for the Sumy incursion here. So yeah, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Oh yeah, by the way, before I log off here, the main thing is that the one prediction I have is that I think the Ukrainians are about to attack Moscow on May 9th, for the victory parade. So I'm calling it now. I do think it's going to happen. I'm pretty certain of that. But, even if it's just a drone attack that fails or something, I do think the Ukrainians have some plans to do that. But yeah, that's just the prediction of mine. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.